Hello crafty friends, welcome to today's video. Today I have got 3 cards for you, all based on the same design idea but made with a variety of different techniques. So hopefully if you like the design idea you can recreate it with the tools and supplies that you have in your stash. So for card number 1 I decided to do some watercolouring. I've got some watercolour paper and my Mungyo watercolours. And I've just drawn some rough blobby shapes lightly with a pencil to give me an idea of where I want to paint. This is quite an abstract design. My blobs aren't meant to look like anything in particular. It's just something that I find quite pleasing. So I've chosen an indigo paint and I have picked up some with my paintbrush, put it on my glass mat, added some water to get it nice and runny, and then painted it roughly in the blob that I drew. When I'd got all the paint down, I picked up my paper and tilted it this way and that to encourage the paint to spread out. And when I was happy that I'd got a nice even layer of paint, I gave it a gentle dry with my hairdryer because I wanted to do a wet on dry technique. I wanted my blobs to overlap, but I didn't want the colours to mix. So I made sure that the colour that I'd put down was dry before I put the next colour on top. For my next colour, I chose a yellow ochre and I did exactly the same thing. Picked up my paint with my paintbrush, put it down on my glass mat, added some water to make it nice and runny and dilute, and then carefully painted it on, overlapping the blue blob a little bit. And because these paints, watercolour paints in general, tend to be quite transparent, you get a new colour forming where one overlaps the other. So I've got a kind of, I guess, murky green appearing where the yellow ochre overlaps the indigo. When I picked up my paper and tilted it, I did get a bead of excess paint forming. And all I did to deal with this was dry my paintbrush on a paper towel and then use that paintbrush to carefully suck up the excess paint. And then when I was happy that there was a nice even sheen of paint across my blob, I dried it gently with my hairdryer again. For my third blob, I chose a kind of brick red colour. I'm going for quite earthy tones mainly with these cards. And I filled in the bottom blob in exactly the same way as I did with the others. And I used a dry paintbrush to pick up excess paint and dried it with my hairdryer. Next I chose a nice warm grey for my small blob in the top left hand corner. And for my final colour, I wanted to bring in a pop of a non-neutral. So I chose a kind of turquoisey blue, which I mixed myself. I used 3 different paints, picking each one up in turn, mixing it on my palette, adding some water until I was happy with the colour. If you want to find out more about watercolouring on cards, I do have a watercolour card playlist where you get a bit more detail about some of the techniques like wet on dry and wet in wet and glazing, that kind of thing. So I will leave a link to that in the video description below. Just click on the more and it should open up and reveal all the relevant information. So once all my watercolours were nice and dry, I dusted my panel with some talcum powder to remove any moisture, grease or static, and then I used an embossing pen to draw some lines, fairly straight but a little bit wonky to give them a hand-drawn look. On the right hand side of my card, overlapping the turquoisey and yellow blobs. I then sprinkled on some Wow polished gold embossing powder, heated it with my heat tool, and that gave me some lovely bright gold lines. Again, just adding a bit of abstract interest. I then repeated the process, but this time I used the thicker end of the embossing pen and drew a wobbly wonky circle, which I sprinkled with a white embossing powder. Once that was cooled and set, I did go in with my pen again and add a little bit of extra ink and a little bit of extra powder just to make it really opaque so the white stood out very well against the colourful blobs. To add some contrast, I brought in a black gel pen and added a row of black dots about 1/3 of the way in from the left hand side. I used my T-square ruler just as a visual guide to make sure I got the dots roughly straight. I didn't allow the ink to touch the ruler though, because if you do that, sometimes when you take the ruler away, you can smudge your ink. And that was the first stage of card number 1 done. Now on to card number 2. For this card, I wanted to do some stamping, but as I didn't have exactly the right blob shape stamps, I decided to make my own using craft foam. So I drew on some craft foam with a pencil, some blobs that were similar to the ones that I watercoloured, and then I cut them out with a pair of scissors. Next, I glued my foam stamps onto the door of my stamp positioner and stamped them on some smooth white card. I chose Catherine Pooler inks because they're dye inks, they're translucent, and when you overlap them, you get a brand new colour. Now my stamps here have already got some colour on them, but that's because I tested them out to make sure they worked properly. If I added the ink with the ink pad, and then kind of blended them around a bit with a finger dauber, they stamped nice and smoothly. And I stamped each colour twice because I wanted to get a fairly intense colour. So the colours I used were Tranquil, which is the dark blue, Whipped Honey for the yellow, Cummerbund for the turquoisey colour, Apricot for the orangey colour, and Pebble for the grey colour. To add my black dots, I used a Zig Clean Colour dot marker. For my gold lines, I used a Jelly Roll gold gel pen. And for my white circle, I did try and use a white gel pen, but it didn't show up enough. I do have trouble with white gel pens. They just don't seem very reliable. So I abandoned the white gel pen idea and brought in a white paint marker. This was a lot more opaque and stood out really well. The lines were a bit thicker than I wanted them, but you've just got to work with what you've got. I gave that a dry with my hairdryer and added a few little extra bits with a white pen just to make it a little bit more opaque in places. And then I moved on to card number 3, and I decided to go through my blob stamps, and I just pulled out anything that kind of worked with this design and stamped them in the same ink colours. For the circle, I used a ring stamp and some white pigment ink, which I then sprinkled with white embossing powder and heated. Once that was cooled and set, I used a grungy line stamp, added some embossing ink using an embossing dauber. I didn't want to ink up the whole of the stamp, and the quickest and easiest way for me to add some ink to the areas that I did want to stamp was just to grab this dauber. I then sprinkled on the gold embossing powder and heated that. And then for my black dots, I found a stamp that had a whole line of black dots, which was absolutely perfect, and I stamped that in black ink. And here you go, all 3 side by side. And then I mounted them on a card blank. Now I gave the watercolour background a black matte because the watercolour paper is quite creamy and it can look a bit weird when you put a creamy cardstock on a white card blank, and the black matte just separates them a little bit. I didn't do this with the others, but I think they would have benefited from black matte. So if I did this again, I would give all 3 of those backgrounds black mattes. For my sentiment, I used a Best Wishes stamp. This is from Clearly Besotted. To finish them off, I splattered on some gold metallic paint. I just felt it needed a bit of something to bind all the different elements together. And on one of the cards, I did manage to stamp the Best Wishes a bit wonky. So to cover that up, I stamped it again on a piece of white card, cut it out with some scissors, and then stuck it over on a bit of craft foam. And that gave it a bit of dimension as well, which I like. So that's these 3 cards finished. They're all based on the same design idea but made with different supplies and tools and techniques. I wonder which one you like the best, which one you might like to have a go at making, or which techniques or tools you'd like to combine. Do let me know in the comments, and if you'd like to see more from me, do subscribe and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.